On November 4th, 2025, a UPS cargo jet loaded with 330,000 pounds of fuel and other hazardous materials begins its takeoff from Louisville International Airport towards Hawaii. Within hours of the crash, a body cam footage from the first responders hit the internet, and it goes absolutely viral. People can't even look away from the apocalyptic scene, the fireball, the wreckage, and the chaos. Even one of the biggest streamers on the platform, XQC, even reacted to it live. This is how massive the story really became. But behind all the reaction videos and the shocking visuals, there's something most people never learn. The 3 pilots inside that airplane had over 50 years of combined MD-11 experience. The pre-flight checks were perfect, the tower clears them for departure, the engine roars, the nose lifts, and then, at 200 miles per hour, 30 feet off the ground, a 3-inch piece of metal that's been cracking for years finally snaps apart. The left engine doesn't just fail, guys. It rips backwards over the wing, it twists around, catches on fire, and turns a regular routine cargo flight into a half-mile path of destruction, with 15 people dead, 3 in the cockpit, and 12 on the ground. And here's the part that should make you the angriest. Boeing knew this would happen this entire time. They warned airlines about it 14 years ago, and they even designed a replacement part specifically to fix it. But they labeled the problem as not a safety issue, so nothing was mandatory this entire time. And therefore, UPS just kept on flying with the old faulty part. To understand how a perfectly legal aircraft became a fireball, we need to go back to the last place this plane was inspected. It is September 3rd, 2025, VT San Antonio Aerospace, N259 UP. The MD-11 that would become Flight 2976 rolls into maintenance hangar for what's called a heavy check. This isn't a quick look, this is 6 weeks of deep inspection and repair. The plane would stay grounded until October 18th, which is 46 days from now. And during that time, all the mechanics were all over the aircraft. They are fixing a cracked fuel tank, they're removing corrosion, they're checking systems, and on October 18th, just 17 days before the crash, they complete a specific task. And that task was to lubricate the Pyron spherical bearings, the exact part that would later fail on the runway. Think about that for a second. A mechanic was close enough to grease the bearings that would hold a 12,000 pound engine to the wing, close enough to touch them, close enough to see them, but the checklist didn't say inspect for cracks. It said to lubricate, and that's all they did. This is what investigators are now calling the maintenance gap. When you follow the rulebook so precisely that you miss the obvious problem staring at your face. Because those bearings, they weren't just worn, they were fractured, and the NTSB would later find fatigue cracks that had been grown for years, leaving marks called beach patterns that proved that metal was slowly giving up. And on October 18th, someone was inches away from it, but they never saw it. Or maybe they did see it and assumed someone else's job was to report it. Either way, the plane gets signed off as airworthy, so the paperwork says everything is fine, and 17 days later, UPS loads it with fuel and sends 3 pilots to their end. But this isn't just a story about one missed inspection. The real tragedy? Boeing saw this coming over a decade ago. On February 7th, 2011, Boeing has issued a service letter with this code name MD-11 SL54-104A. It's not a headline, it's not a recall either. It's a quiet technical bulletin sent to all airlines operating the MD-11. And buried in that letter is a confession. Between 2007 and 2010, this exact bearing with the part number S0399-1 failed 4 times on 3 different MD-11 aircrafts before. It is the same failure mode every single time. The spherical bearing race, a metal ring that acts like the socket in the ball and socket joint, cracked at a design flaw called the recess groove. The crack would then grow around the entire circumference of the part, and when it splits into 2, the pieces would then migrate forward and backwards, sticking out past the metal lugs that are supposed to hold them in place. The Boeing engineers knew what was happening. They even designed a new bearing for it, which is the part number S00399-523. That eliminated the entire recess groove entirely. And you think this is problem solved, right? Nope. you are entirely wrong, because here's what Boeing put in the letter instead. After reviewing the failures, they determined that a complete fracture of the spherical bearing race would not result in a safety of flight condition. Read that again. Not a safety of flight condition. That one sentence alone is why 15 people are dead right now. Because if it's not classified as a safety issue, the FAA doesn't even issue an airworthiness directive. And if there is no AD, the fix stays optional. Airlines can choose either to install the new bearing if they want, or they can just keep using the old one and possibly save themselves some money, even though most of the time they really don't. And guess what UPS did instead? They just kept the old one. So did FedEx, so did every other MD-11 operator there was. Because why wouldn't they? Boeing said it was fine, the FAA didn't force them to change it, and the plane had been flying for over 30 years without this being a grounding issue. Except, it wasn't fine. And on November 4th, 2025, the decision finally caught up to them. 5:13 p.m., runway 17R, flight 2976 finally lines up. One of the captains, Captain Richard Wardenberg, is in the left seat. First Officer Lee Trout is on the right side. International Relief Officer Dana Diamond is behind them. All three of them know this plane inside out. Combined, they have tens of thousands of hours on the MD-11. The tower gives them the clearance, the throttles go forward, and the three General Electric CF6 engines, each producing a total of 60,000 pounds of thrust, push the fully loaded jet down the runway. At around 160 knots, the nose finally lifts off, and the plane rotates, the wings generate lift, and for about 2 seconds, everything was normal. And then the left pylon aft mount, the piece of metal that connects to the engine to the wing, gives up. The spherical bearing inside has been cracking for years. 75% of the metal is already compromised, and at the exact moment the plane commits to flight, the last 25% fractures. The bearing race splits in half. The forward piece slides forward, and the aft piece slides backwards, and suddenly the engine has no socket to sit in. What happens next is pure physics. A spinning jet engine at full thrust is a massive gyroscope. When the mount fails, the engine doesn't just fall, it fights. It uses its own rotational force to twist backwards, climbing over the wing like it's prying itself free. Surveillance footage from the airport catches it all. The engine flips, fire erupts near the wing attachment, and the plane now missing a third of its power and with its aerodynamics completely destroyed and no longer climbing. It clears the blast fence at the end of the runway. The left landing gear clips the roof of the UPS warehouse. And then gravity takes over. The MD-11 rolls left, and the nose drops, and 30 feet above the ground, with no altitude to recover, the crew has about 30 seconds to process what's happening before the plane finally hits the Kentucky Petroleum Recycling Facility at 200 miles per hour. The explosion is so massive that people 10 miles away see the fireball. Over 200,000 pounds of jet fuel finally ignites instantly. The crash site becomes a live burning furnace. Here's a question nobody can answer at first. Why didn't the pilots recover? The MD-11 has 3 engines. Lose one, and you should still be able to fly on the other 2. It won't be pretty, but it's survivable. Pilots trained for this. So what went wrong? The NTSB is still investigating on it, but the evidence points to something catastrophic. When the left engine ripped off, it didn't leave quietly. Surveillance footage shows debris trailing behind the separated pylon. Big chunks of metal, pieces of the engine cowling, and all that debris was moving in one direction, straight back toward the tail. The MD-11's third engine, engine number 2, sits in the tail. It's mounted vertically with an intake that points forward, and if the debris from engine number 1 got sucked into the intake, that tail engine would have ingested metal at high speed, shredding the turbine blades and shutting it down almost instantly. So now, the crew isn't flying on 2 engines anymore. They're flying on 1. Engine number 3, mounted on the right wing. And a fully loaded wide-body cargo jet with 330,000 pounds of fuel cannot climb on a single engine, especially not at a 30 feet altitude with the left wing on fire and the airframe rolling. The pilots would have felt it immediately. The yaw, the roll, the nose dropping, and they would have known there was no recovering from this. Flight 2976 wasn't just a mechanical failure, it was a cascade. One part broke, and that part destroyed the second system. And with no altitude and no options, physics did the rest. But this exact scenario had already happened before. It's May 25th, 1979, at Chicago O'Hare. American Airlines Flight number 191, a DC-10, begins its takeoff roll. Seconds after the rotation, the left engine and the pylon separate from the wing, and the plane rolls to the left, stalls, and crashes into an open field. 273 people died that day. It was the deadliest aviation accident in US history, and the cause? Maintenance error. The mechanics had used an improper procedure to remove and reinstall the engine pylon, cracking a critical attachment point. The NTSB blamed maintenance. The FAA issued new rules, and the industry moved on. But the MD-11 and the DC-10 shared the same basic pylon design. Same attachment system, same spherical bearings, same engineering principles, and yet 46 years later, UPS Flight 2976 follows the exact same failure pattern with the left engine and the pylon separation, and the result of that was another fireball crash. The only difference is that the American 191 was blamed on human error during maintenance, whereas UPS Flight 2976 was being blamed on a known design flaw that Boeing said it wasn't dangerous. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If that exact same failure mode killed 273 people in 1979, how did Boeing conclude in 2011 that it wouldn't be a safety issue in 2025? And the answer was that Boeing assumed that the bearing would crack slowly enough that visual inspections would catch it before it failed. They assumed mechanics would see the bearing sticking out past the lugs and flag it, but assumptions don't survive reality. Visual inspections only happen every 60 months, which is 5 years. And in 5 years, a crack can grow from invisible to catastrophic without anyone noticing. Flight 2976 had 21,000 cycles on the airframe, and the detailed inspection for these mounts wasn't due until 28,000 cycles. The plane was 7,000 cycles away from being checked out, and that window was just long enough for the crack to finish spreading. November 7th, 2025, 3 days after the crash, UPS voluntarily grounds its MD-11 fleet, and the next day the FAA issues an Emergency Airworthiness Directive 2025-23-51. Every MD-11 and MD-10 in service worldwide is grounded until the pylon mounts are inspected properly. FedEx follows, other carriers follow, and what do they find? Multiple aircrafts with cracks in the same part. Not all of them, but just enough to prove that this wasn't a one-off failure. This was systemic. On January 23rd, 2026, UPS finally made a decision. They retired their entire MD-11 fleet permanently. They take a $137 million loss to walk away from the aircraft entirely, not because the planes were too old, but because the trust between them were gone. Boeing had stayed quiet for quite some time. They issued a brief statement, but haven't committed on why the 2011 service letter didn't result in mandatory action. The NTSB is investigating 3 questions. How was the service letter incorporated into the maintenance manuals? Did UPS follow Boeing's recommended inspections? And why didn't the FAA treat a known failure mode as mandatory? Those answers will take months to come, but the families of the 15 victims don't have months. So what actually needs to change? Because grounding planes after people die isn't a solution, it's damage control. If we want to prevent the next Flight 2976 from happening, 3 things need to happen, and they need to be written into law ASAP. First, we need to end the service letter era. Right now, when Boeing discovers a dangerous flaw, they can issue something called a service letter. It's a polite suggestion sent to airlines saying, hey, you might want to look at this part, it's been failing, but it's not mandatory. Airlines can ignore it all they want, and after all, they usually do, because fixing things costs a lot of money. A lot of money. Here's what needs to happen instead. Any service letter that mentions structural separation or fatigue cracking on aircraft over 20 years old needs to be automatically converted into an airworthiness directive. That means it is no longer optional. It is officially a law. The FAA needs to stop letting manufacturers decide what counts as dangerous. If a part can separate and bring down a plane, then it's dangerous. Period. End of discussion. Second, maintenance facilities need to adopt what's called the Integrated Inspection Protocol. Here's the problem right now. When a mechanic goes into the hangar to lubricate a bearing, their job is to lubricate the bearing, not inspect it, not look for cracks, just grease it and move on. That's what happened in San Antonio. Someone touched the exact part that would later kill 15 people, and they never saw the cracks because nobody told them to look. This has to change. If you are lubricating a pylon bearing, you should be legally required to perform a fluorescent penetrant inspection. That's a test where you apply a special dye to the metal that seeps into the cracks invisible to the naked eye. Then you shine a UV light on it and the cracks glow. And the tool is not even expensive at all. This is similar to the UV dyes that the auto mechanics use to diagnose leaks in our cars. The San Antonio mechanics were close enough to do this test, but the checklist didn't require it, so they didn't. And now 15 people are gone. The holistic search model means if you are working on a wing, you inspect everything critical in that area, not just what the manual tells you to check. And lastly, the liability shift. This is a big one. Right now, if an airline follows the FAA minimum requirements, they're legally protected. Even if a safer option exists, even if the manufacturer designed a better part for it, as long as the airline is meeting the bare minimum, they can't be held liable. That's what happened here. Boeing designed a new, stronger bearing in 2011. The part number for it, S00399-523. I'm pretty sure you've heard me repeat that number for the remainder of this video, but this is how important it is. It eliminated the design flaw entirely, but UPS kept using the old part S00399-1 because the FAA didn't force them to upgrade it. And when that old part failed, UPS pointed to their maintenance logs and said we followed the rules. And technically they did, but here's the problem. Following the minimum shouldn't be good enough when lives are at stake. If a safer part exists and you choose not to install it just to save money, you should be held liable for what happens next. Call it the gold standard. If a manufacturer offers an upgraded component that fixes a known failure mode, carriers should have to prove why they didn't install it, not the other way around, because right now the system rewards the cheapest option, and the cheapest option killed 15 people. So, here's what we know. Boeing identified a dangerous flaw in 2011. They designed the fix, but they labeled it optional. The FAA didn't force airlines to install it. UPS just kept on flying with the old part. And on November 4th, 2025, that old part failed exactly the way Boeing said it would, and exactly the way that killed 273 people in 1979. This wasn't just a freak accident, guys. This was a preventable tragedy. The question isn't whether the system failed. The question is why we keep pretending optional safety is good enough. The MD-11 era is over, but the mindset that allowed this to happen, it's still here. And until regulators stop letting manufacturers decide what counts as a safety issue, the next optional fix is just a matter of time. 17 days. That's how long it had been since someone touched the part that killed 15 people. 17 days since a mechanic was close enough to see the cracks, close enough to stop this. But the checklist didn't ask them to look, so they didn't. And now, people are gone, and we're left asking the same question we asked in 1979. How many people have to die before optional becomes mandatory? Comment down below on what you think about all of this, and subscribe for more.